to a database. But Milgram has an article, The Nature and Extent of Idolatry in 8th and 7th century BC Judah. Again, this is the monarchic period, leading up into the point of exile here. And it just has some interesting stuff in it. I want to read you a few excerpts from it. He says here that the datable biblical literature of the 8th century accuses Israel of idolatry 15 times. The literature of the following 7th century does it 166 times, which is really an imbalance. Right? So Milgram says, in the 7th century, the prophets repeatedly stated that idolatry, quote, pollutes its inheritance, the temple and the land. It just all over the place they use this pollute terminology. The quantitative difference in the number of statements on idolatry between the 8th and 7th centuries is accentuated by the difference in the effects of idolatry, as illustrated by the use of this term, tameh, to be unclean. All of that kind of language occurs in texts that are datable to the 7th century. Now, think about it. 7th century is the 600 BC, 600s BC. 8th century is the 700s BC. Well, most of the attention in the 8th century BC, again, this is Mike talking now, most of the attention in 8th century BC texts is going to be the northern, apostate kingdom. And you get, 15 times complaining about the idolatry and whatnot. It's exponentially more after the northern kingdom is gone. And you say, well, why would that be? Well, I think it's kind of obvious, because now you're talking about Judah, and you're talking about the place where Yahweh's own house is. You're talking about the place of the Davidic dynasty, the Davidic covenant, whole thing, the temple. And so the prophets basically just lose their minds that this kind of thing has now moved south into Judah and is just exploding. Okay, and so they just go kind of berserk, with this whole situation. And the texts reflect this dramatically more vociferous concern or objection in the 7th century because of the proximity to the presence of Yahweh in Jerusalem. So it just gets blown up into a much bigger deal. So Milgram says, again, it's sort of in a summary statement, how can we account for this stupendous change? First, as we mentioned above, we must take the book of Kings at its word. Jehu in North Israel and Jehoiada in Judah wiped out the Baal cult during the second half of the 9th century. In effect, that means that state-sponsored paganism was basically eradicated. It is absent through the 8th century, so there's not as much of it, and where it is, it's going to be in the north. To be sure, there was private fetishism. He uses that term, private idolatry. But the 8th century prophets were virtually unconcerned about, again, this sort of private people going off and doing crazy stuff in their house. It was no threat to the worship of Yahweh in his sanctuary or to Israel's existence on its land, because then the issue was, the temple. Now, he says here, to be sure, Molech worship and necromancy are indeed indicated in the text, but the general populace didn't view these acts as, incompatible with their allegiance to Yahweh, a misconception that, the prophets are going to try to correct. But his point is that the big issue for the prophets, and the thing he's arguing that really gets tied to the land, is when you start using rival cult centers and building rival cult centers in Jerusalem, in proximity to Yahweh's presence in the temple, that was essentially the straw that broke the camel's back. That is sort of the trigger point to God saying, enough. I'm going, the northern kingdom, got what it deserved because of idolatry. The Davidic dynasty is still intact. This is a legitimate dynasty. This is where I live. This is my temple. This is my sanctuary. This is sacred ground. But it doesn't matter. Okay, if you're going to invade my sacred space with this kind of stuff, you're all toast. I'm not going to spare the monarchy. I'm not going to spare the priesthood. I'm not gonna, my hands are not tied. You know, God is basically saying, my hands are not tied here just because the temple's here, just because this is where my presence is. I'm going to drive you from the land. And so that again, the prophetic criticism, the call, against apostasy doesn't go away or doesn't get any softer because, oh, now we're talking about Jerusalem and David's line. God says, who gives a rip? I don't care what we're talking about here. In fact, this is exactly the sort of thing that I warned you back in Leviticus 26, back in the Torah, that I would do if you violated this. So don't think there's any security in the fact that, hey, we're still alive and we didn't get, killed off with the 10 tribes in the north. And they're the ones that split, they're the ones that split up the kingdom. Those are the bad guys. We're here in Judah. We're loyal to David. We only have Davidic kings down here, and we have the temple. We're not, building other temples. We're all these high places. Yeah, we still use those. And yeah, Solomon built a couple of those, and we didn't tear them down, but we still have the temple here, and this is God's place, and God's not going to touch this. He's not going to destroy this because this is his temple. God says, phooey. I don't care. I don't care about any of the things you think keep you safe with respect to your relationship with me. What I care about is, where is your loyalty? You're not going to dress yourself up with these other things, while on the other hand, you're doing exactly the same things I said would mean expulsion from the land. It's just not going to protect you. So I think it's really, again, just sort of an interesting perspective. I mean, Milgram goes on in the article. He does a lot of other interesting things. He talks about how with the prophets, the big deal, again, was state-sponsored paganism. In other words, you don't just build a high place. You don't build Bamot next to the temple, in Jerusalem or in Judah or in proximity to, to the holy city. You don't just do that. That takes royal approval. That takes state sponsorship. Okay, those things don't get built unless the people in charge, who are the kings and even peripherally the priests, those things don't happen unless those people either approve them or don't try to stop them. And so, again, that's the real issue. That you don't have any account in the Old Testament of prophets or priests or kings or anybody going house to house checking to see if they have Asherah figures, their little idols or teraphim or anything like that. So there's no indication that anybody called for or sort of tried to eradicate idolatry at a house-to-house level. What's typically the focus is this state-sponsored paganism. Because, again, this is David's line. David, the man after God's own heart. The line that God promised, was the only legitimate one that would sit on the throne. And the temple, the only place that God said, I will put my name there, I will dwell there. That is the far greater focus of apostasy and idolatry. And frankly, if the priests start doing their job, people are just going to do what they're going to do. And this makes me think of like situations now. And I'm not going to name any names. I'm not going to give too pointed an illustration here, but we all know Christians in churches who do stuff that we kind of hear or we see and we think, good grief, if the Lord was here, he'd just have a canary. I mean, he would just go berserk. He would say, this is nuts. This is just not legitimate. This is not real worship. This is abominable. This is wrong. It's bad. It's misguided, whatever. Okay, we all know that. And so that's kind of the lens through which I look at stuff like this. That, yeah, people, and nobody has Bibles. Okay, they're all dependent on the priests. They're all dependent on, if mom and dad learn anything from the priest, they're supposed to transmit it to the kids. I mean, nobody can just go look up, hey, should we do this or not? Should we do this or that? Is it okay to use this cult center now, even though we have a temple? It's kind of a shorter trip, and Yahweh was worshipped there by our ancestors. Is that okay? Well, if you don't have prophets or priests or whoever teaching the people, they're just going to go astray. And it's not that God is thrilled with that or God approves of it. He doesn't, because that's part of the critique here. But what he's far more concerned with is the institutional faith, is institutional Israelite religion, state-sponsored paganism. Do with that what you want, but I mean, I look at the church on an institutional level, and again, we can all think of just bizarro world examples where ministries and churches have just literally jumped the shark. I mean, they are apostate, and because they're big, because they're public, again, because they have lots of people under their charge or under their care, and multitudes are led astray. What the situation was here back in Judah is a much bigger problem. That is a much bigger concern because it's institutionalized.